Ladies and gentlemen, fight fans all around the world, let's talk some boxing. First and foremost, my apologies to those of you who have offended because, I've been insulting to you guys. That's not cool. And I need to lead by example, even if some people are insulting to me. Mark 10:42-45 says that they who want to be the greatest leader among people, they need to be the greatest servant. So I need to really adopt that principle. So I want to apologize to all my subscribers for insulting or jeering at other people just because I know something they don't know. But it also works the other way. If anybody on this channel comes on here and is abusive to anyone on this channel, calling names, being derogatory, and or you are someone who is supposedly arguing a point, but you're adamant in your view even though all the evidence suggests otherwise and you sound nonsensical, I will simply censor you by removing you from my channel and your comments. I'm totally about freedom of speech, but some things just don't fly in this environment. And in this environment, what you need, we should really be trying to edify and improve one another. You can't do that, your comments will be taken down. Alright? It's real cool. Real simple. Thank you for the support, my 556 subscribers. I also appreciate the fact that you guys are also sharing my videos. Thank you very much. I hope to be able to educate you more on the sport of boxing as we move along. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why the emphasis that is placed so heavily on a boxer being in their prime, whether it's physical prime or prime, is sometimes overrated. And to be able to discriminate between physical prime and prime, it's very simple. The physical prime of a boxer is when they are at their peak athleticism and ability, but their prime takes into account some other factors like experience. But generally speaking, a boxer being in their prime and physical prime, they do work in harmony. And the age that we found out a boxer is at their physical prime and therefore at their prime is usually 24 years to 30 years of age, plus or minus a couple years. So we're going to use that, since we already have a video that showed that, talked about the age at which a boxer is in their prime. We're going to use that to illustrate to you why there's, I think, a little too much overemphasis on a boxer being in their prime. Because some of the boxers we're about to cover here, including Muhammad Ali, did most of their most notable and great acts after their prime. So let's get into it. Muhammad Ali, born 1942, debuted professionally as a boxer in 1960. That means at the age of 18, he entered the pros. Now, if we're talking about the end of his prime, because we're going to focus on the end of a boxer's prime and onwards, then that would be 12 years down the road from 1960, which would lead to 1972. Now, when we look in the year 1972, Muhammad Ali, at the end of his prime, had just faced Bob Foster. So he faced Bob Foster, and he was 30 years of age, and before that, he was in his prime. Alright? And you can go ahead and check out all the things he did in his prime. In fact, in his prime, Muhammad Ali had a number of championship fights. Okay? He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 championship fights from 1964 to 1972. Okay? So in 1964, he would have been 22 years of age, and in 1972 he would have been 30 years of age. Okay? So let's look at what happened after Muhammad Ali's prime. After Muhammad Ali's prime, he lost to Ken Norton. But then he would rematch Ken Norton and beat him. He would then rematch Joe Frazier, who he lost to in his prime, and beat him too in 1974. In that same year, he would face the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, George Foreman. And Big George, as he was called, would get knocked out in the 8th round of that fight to cause Muhammad Ali to regain the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world at the age of 32. Muhammad Ali would go on to win the heavyweight championship title 13 times. 13 times. That's more times than when he was in his prime. And Muhammad Ali was able to fight fighters more fearsome than the fighters he fought in his prime. George Foreman clearly was a much more devastating fighter than even Sonny Liston, for the main fact that George Foreman was quick-ish, or quicker than Sonny Liston, had more dimension to himself, and was knocking out everybody. Ron Lyle, another heavy puncher, Muhammad Ali faced. Then Joe Frazier yet another time, the third time, what was known as the Thriller in Manila, in which Muhammad Ali said he came the closest to death. And then he faced Ernie Schaefer's, a feared fighter that most boxers actually did not want to fight. He would regain the heavyweight title after losing it to Liam Spinks, beating Liam Spinks and becoming heavyweight champion for the last time at the tender age of 36, going on 37. Muhammad Ali, his great legacy, the greatest, became solidified in the latter end of his career. In the career where he faced so many great named opponents, even more than when he was in his prime. And that's what made this guy the greatest. The fact that he could adapt his style when his physical prowess started to decline, and use his smarts to be able to outmanipulate his opponents, and therefore, because of that, remain at the top of his division for so long with so many fights. In fact, Muhammad Ali fought more a year than he did in his prime. And that's what makes Muhammad Ali a legend. And that's why just talking about Muhammad Ali in his prime underrates and undervalues Muhammad Ali. See, boxing is 90% mental, 10% physical. And based on that logic, you can see that Muhammad Ali's mentality is what helped him to be such a long-reigning world champion. 23 championship fights he won. Think about that. 13 of them after he was in his prime. Now there's a difference between a fighter being in their prime, and there's a difference between a fighter being out of their prime, and there's a difference between a fighter being washed up or not at the top of his own game and his own division. I'll give you a good example of this. Joe Louis. Joe Louis was born 1914, but he debuted in boxing in 1934. He was 20 years of age when he turned pro. Joe Louis would be out of his prime in 10 years' time. 1944, Joe Louis was out of his prime. And in 1944, he still successfully was defending the heavyweight championship of the world. 1946, against Billy Conn, he knocked him out in the 8th round to still stay heavyweight champion. And he remained heavyweight champion for 4 fights versus Jersey Joe Walcott, and then retired from boxing in 1948. So Joe Louis was in his prime from the first time he won world championship, which was against Jim Braddock in 1937. He was in his prime all the way up to 1944. And what's amazing about this is even after 1944, outside of his prime, he still managed to stay at the top of the game. Now, after he retired from boxing and came back to face Ezzard Charles in 1950, he was no longer in his prime, of course. But he lost to Ezzard Charles as well. So he wasn't at the top of the game anymore. He wasn't at the top of the division anymore. Joe Louis would go on to fight some opponents who were not championship caliber opponents, not former world champions, just like Freddie Beshore. He was just kind of building cash. And he got an opportunity then to face this young upcomer, Rocky Marciano. This was not a championship fight. Rocky Marciano wasn't the world champion. Joe Louis was now fighting to just earn some money because he had debts to pay to the IRS. When Rocky Marciano knocked out Joe Louis, we know that Joe Louis was a shell of his former self. He was doing it to get money. Joe Louis was a washed-up fighter. He was no longer at the peak of the game. He was no longer at the top of the division. Therefore, you could not say that Joe Louis was, had put on excellent performances from there on in. And my point being, he wasn't knocking out fighters like Cesar Silverio Brion. He was just having a unanimous decision. He no longer was knocking out fighters like he was in his prime and then after his prime. My point being this. It's one thing to be out of your prime. It's another thing when you're not top of your division. You're not at the peak performance of your division. Meaning, peak performance, I mean, you are the guy in the division. And even if you're not world champion, you come back to get the world championship or come close to it, and you're a high-level contender. Joe Louis was none of those things. He wasn't even fighting guys who would be contending for a world championship. Now, he was just fighting low-level, low-tier opponents to make money. He was a shell of his former self. That is different. So that people usually cite a boxer's age, but you can't always cite a boxer's age. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Sugar Ray Leonard. Sugar Ray Leonard was born in 1956, began his pro debut in 1977. In short, Sugar Ray Leonard was 21 years of age when he began the pros. 9 years later would be 1986. That would be the end of Sugar Ray Leonard's prime. He would be 30 years of age. In 1986, Sugar Ray Leonard was retired. But when he came back to boxing, he fought a fight that defined him and his legacy forever. His fight against Marvin Hagler. Sugar Ray Leonard was out of his prime, injured, had a bad broken orbital from a fight he had, probably with Thomas Hearns, who knows. But Sugar Ray Leonard returned out of his prime, Sugar Ray Leonard, and faced Marvin Hagler. He was 31 years of age. He beat Marvin Hagler by the thinnest of margins, by split decision, to take the middleweight title of the world. This guy wasn't even fighting at welterweight. He moved up from welterweight and super welterweight to fight at middleweight, and he won the middleweight title, creating a feat that he hadn't done in his prime. Then he went up in weight one more time to face Donnie Lalonde, the light heavyweight champion of the world. This is at the age of 32, 2 years removed from his prime. And he beats him to become the WBC World Light Heavyweight Champion of the world. And also WBC Super Middleweight Champion of the world, a division created just for Sugar Ray Leonard because he could not make the light heavyweight weight. The point I'm making is this. Yes, he got knocked down by Donnie Lalonde once. And then he was able to stop Donnie Lalonde late in the fight because Donnie Lalonde was, of course, drained because he had to lose all that weight to fight Sugar Ray Leonard. But the point anyway is this. He did a feat, again, greater than the feat he did before by beating Marvin Hagler. He beat an even bigger opponent. This is what made Sugar Ray Leonard a legend. Sugar Ray Leonard a legend. He then goes on, of course, he's on a downward slope physically for a long time now. He's been on a downward slope since his orbital injury, okay? Since his Bruce Finch and Kevin Howard fights, he's been on a downward slope. He fights Marvin Hagler. This is not prime Sugar Ray Leonard, but it's a smart Sugar Ray Leonard how boxed again. Using smarts, IQ, he gets to the top of the middleweight division. He faced Donnie Lalonde, and he's ranked pretty high at light heavyweight. He's in his peak performance because he's a world champion. He goes on to face Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Arguably Hearns beat him, but they gave him a draw. Again, you see the downward slope with Sugar Ray Leonard. He faces Roberto Duran in 1989. Beats Roberto Duran. But in 1991, at the age of 35, Sugar Ray Leonard is decimated by Terry Norris. Sugar Ray Leonard looks like a shell of his former self. And against Hector Camacho, he's knocked out in 1997 at the age of 40. What's that? 44, I think it is. 44. My point anyway is this. The Sugar Ray Leonard that faced Terry Norris and Hector Camacho is a shot Sugar Ray Leonard. It's not just a Sugar Ray Leonard out of his prime. But Sugar Ray Leonard out of his prime didn't mean that he didn't do some memorable feats greater than what he ever did in his prime. Against Marvin Hagler, he did an incredible thing by fighting at middleweight. Then he went even up a higher weight class and fought at super middleweight, and he accomplished a great thing. That was probably the last time Sugar Ray Leonard was really at the peak of his game. But, no, actually I'm wrong. He went on to draw with Thomas Hearns, and then he beats Roberto Duran for the WBC World Super Middleweight title. He maintains his super middleweight status. He's able to defend his super middleweight title twice successfully. Okay? Against Thomas Hearns and then Roberto Duran. That's the last time Sugar Ray Leonard's at the top of his game. When he comes back into boxing 2 years later, he's beaten by Terry Norris very badly. And then in 1997, he's simply destroyed by Hector Camacho. My point being this. You see the difference between a fighter being outside of his prime, but yet at the top of his division and at the top of his game, and then a fighter who's washed up. Now, a lot of times people associate a fighter who's not in their prime as washed up. But you can't say that, and that's my point. Let me go on to another example of a fighter who, his entire career that's notable, that makes him a recognizable figure, was outside of his prime, and that's Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins began his boxing career in 1988, but became world champion. Oh, by the way, that was at the age of 23. Became world champion in 1995 when he was 30 years of age, at the end of his prime. He would turn out to be the longest reigning middleweight champion ever. Oh, actually, he was 29. So it was just at the end of his prime that he became world champion. And one fight in, one defense in, he was 30 years of age. And then the following year, he was outside of his prime. So from Steve Frank, his fights with Steve Frank onwards, Bernard Hopkins, all of his notable career was outside of his prime. That's crazy, isn't it? He faced names like John David Jackson, Glenn Johnson, Simon Brown, Antoine Eccles, Keith Holmes, Felix Trinidad, William Joppy, Oscar de la Hoya, Howard Eastman. All of these people he faced were outside of his prime. In fact, when he faced Howard Eastman, Bernard Hopkins was 40-something years old. I think 40 years old was flat, which is crazy. Okay? He goes on to face Winky Ronald Wright at a higher weight class. Antonio Tarver, Joe Kazaki, Kelly Pavlik, Roy Jones Jr., Jean Pascal, Chad Dawson, Tavoris Cloud, he beats at the age of 46. Defends, and then he faces and unifies with Cairo Bibert Shubanov at the age of 48. Okay, he was 47, sorry, with Tavares Cloud. Chad Dawson was 46. 48. Then faced Sergey Kovalev at the age of 48. And in 2016, he tried to face a young, strong champion, Joe Smith Jr., at the age of 50. Bernard Hopkins was only a shell of his former self in his very last fight against Joe Smith Jr. Besides Sergey Kovalev, Bernard Hopkins always stayed at the top of his division. He was the man at light heavyweight, and he was the man at middleweight. And here's the joke about the whole thing. Bernard Hopkins did all of that outside of his prime. So once again, there is a difference between a fighter being in his prime. A fighter being outside of his prime can still be as effective or even more effective because he's smarter, because boxing is all 90% mental, 10% physical. He could be actually more effective than when he was in his prime. Let's look at another boxer, Juan Manuel Marquez. Very same story as Bernard Hopkins. Started his debut in 1993 at the age of 20, became world champion at the age of 30 in the year 2003 against Manuel Medina for the vacant IBF World Featherweight Championship. He faced Manny Pacquiao when he was 31 years of age, outside of his prime. Whether you call it physical prime or that doesn't really matter to me. He was outside of his prime. He was the unified world champion because he beat Derek Gainer to get the WBA super featherweight title. He was the unified featherweight champion. He would go on outside of his prime to face Orlando Salido, beat him. He would face Chris John, Marco Antonio Barrera, Rocky Juarez, Manny Pacquiao again, Joel Casamayor, Juan Diaz, Floyd Mayweather, Juan Diaz again, Manny Pacquiao, Fedchenko to win another world title, Manny Pacquiao again, and Timothy Bradley Jr., as well as Mike Alvarado. Guess how old he was when he faced Mike Alvarado? You got it. That's right. He was 41 years of age when he faced Mike Alvarado. That's ridiculous when you think about it. Of course, Mike Alvarado wasn't a world champion or anything. It was just like one of those interim belts. But the point being that he was at the top of his game in 2012 when he was 39 years of age. He knocked out Manny Pacquiao in 2012. He was the super lightweight world champion, WBO, in 2012 when he beat Fedchenko. This guy was at the top of his game so late in the game. We're talking about many years after he had been in his prime. The only fight he had in his prime was Freddie Norwood for the featherweight championship of the world. Think about what I'm saying. So, once again, Marquez is yet to be seen as washed up. Nobody has seen him washed up yet. Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar De La Hoya, for the bulk of his career, was in his prime. He began in 1992 at the age of 19 years of age. So that 11 years down the road, Oscar De La Hoya in 2003 would be at the end of his prime. So in 2003, Oscar De La Hoya ended his prime facing Shane Mosley in a fight I thought Oscar De La Hoya actually won. This was his second match with Shane Mosley. Before that, he had faced a number of great fighters. But after that, he went up to middleweight, faced a fighter named Felix Sturm, who was undefeated at the time, and he beat him by unanimous decision. Oscar De La Hoya, of course, you can argue lost that fight, but that's not the point, because I thought Felix Sturm outboxed him. But the point is, he attained the middleweight title, something he had never done before, 6th divisional title, to make him one of those rare people to win titles in 6 different divisions alongside Manny Pacquiao. What's even more amazing is the fact that he then faced the legend Bernard Hopkins, who himself was past his prime a long time ago. He faced Bernard Hopkins to try to unify to become the undisputed middleweight champion of the world. Now, even though he lost that fight to Bernard Hopkins, he did put on an admirable performance for 9 rounds. It's just that Hopkins caught him with a good liver shot, and that was that. Now, he would go on a long recess from boxing, but when he came back to boxing, he fought at his division that he was most comfortable with, which he should have been fighting in anyway, which was super welterweight. He had exceeded himself and was able to win a middleweight fight. But really, he was a super welterweight. He fought at super welterweight, and he knocked out Ricardo Mayorga. He's the guy going down in history as knocking out Ricardo Mayorga in the shortest space of time ever, 6 rounds. Nobody else has done that to Ricardo Mayorga, except when he was washed up. Shane Mosley did the same thing. But nonetheless, Ricardo Mayorga was knocked out in 6 rounds. Felix Trinidad didn't do that. Shane Mosley didn't do it the first time, because Ricardo Mayorga is a tough dude. Oscar did it. That was a remarkable performance. And then he faces Floyd Mayweather Jr. and loses to him by split decision. We argue it's unanimous, but whatever. And then he goes and he faces Steve Forbes, who's not a world champion or anything, and he doesn't knock him out. He doesn't defeat him in any significant way. Of course, this was a catch weight of 150 pounds. It wasn't the full 154, so Oscar didn't really look healthy. And then he went down to welterweight and was just obliterated by Manny Pacquiao because he had just lost too much weight. In this case, Oscar was a shell of himself, not because of his age per se. It was because of his conditioning. The Steve Forbes fight showed us that Oscar was just too dehydrated to really fight a really good fight. And then when he went to Manny Pacquiao, he came in 145 pounds officially on the scale. He only added 2 extra pounds on fight night. And Oscar's a dude. He's a very healthy dude. He walks around probably 180 pounds. And obviously on fight night, he needs to rehydrate to somewhere between 165 and 172 pounds, seeing that he was all the way up to middleweight. You know, Oscar's not just one of those guys who can just shrink down and blow up. You know what I mean? So this wasn't so much that he was a shot fighter because of his age. It was a shot fighter because of his health and well-being going into those fights. Now Shane Mosley. It's really amazing. Shane Mosley, again, he was born in 1971, debuted in 1993 at the age of 22 years of age. And Shane Mosley, therefore, 8 years from 1993, would have been at the end of his prime. 8 years from 1993 would make him 30 years of age, which would have been 2001. So Shane Mosley reached the end of his prime in 2001. What was happening in the year 2001? Shane Mosley had moved up to welterweight, beaten Oscar De La Hoya, and he was in his third defense against Adrian Stone. And he was able to knock him out in 3 rounds, and then he faced Vernon Forrest. He faced Vernon Forrest when he was just out of his prime in 2002, and Vernon Forrest just had the style to beat Shane Mosley, and he beat him up. Then he went up in weight to super welterweight, faced Raul Marquez, but that fight was somehow disqualified, I think because Mosley tested positive for steroids. He then rematched Oscar De La Hoya and beat him the second time, but we argue that Oscar won that fight. And then he goes to fight Winky Ronald Wright. He's, of course, the unified WBC, WBA champion, and he's trying to unify with Winky Ronald Wright to become the undisputed. Winky Ronald Wright, in other words, beats him twice. Okay, now remember, he's out of his prime, beats him twice, and then he goes down to welterweight, fights David Estrada and company. Then he goes back up to super welterweight and faces Fernando Vargas. It's not any championship fight, but it is for a title eliminator to face the champion. He faces Fernando Vargas and he knocks him out twice. The first fight, he knocks him out, comes to get a rematch, knocks him out faster. He then goes down to welterweight, faces Louis Collazo in 2007. Louis Collazo was a welterweight champion. He lost his welterweight championship to Ricky Hatton. So Mosley comes and fights him to get the interim championship, which he does. He beats Louis Collazo in a tough fought fight. And that gives him the chance to go face a world champion. He ends up facing the WBA world welterweight champion Miga Cotto, who beats him. And then he moves up to super welterweight to face Ricardo Mayorga. The tough Ricardo Mayorga. And he knocks out Ricardo Mayorga in the 12th and final round, in the final seconds of the round. He will go on to face Antonio Margarito and knock him out. For the first time in a long time, he has back-to-back knockouts in his career, and he's also the #1 welterweight in the world as a result of beating Antonio Margarito. He faces Floyd Mayweather, he loses to him, and then he has a very horrible performance against Sergio Mora, in which Mora looks like he beats him, and then Manny Pacquiao comes and beats him, knocks him down in round 3, and just beats him around the ring pretty much. And then he faces Saul Canelo Alvarez. Everybody thinks he's washed up, he's gone through for the WBC World Super Welterweight title. And he loses to Saul Canelo Alvarez very convincingly, actually. He just has a lot of durability. He faces a fighter at welterweight called Pablo Cesar Cano, beats him, doesn't knock him out or anything. And then he gets stopped by Anthony Mundine when he goes back up to super welterweight to fight for a sort of interim title. It's not interim, but it's kind of like. And then he faces old, washed up Ricardo Mayorga. Then he faces an unknown guy in Panama. And then he goes and he faces a young fighter, David Avanesian, at welterweight. Who is, he's okay. He's an okay fighter. and Avanesian beats him. Now we know Shane Mosley's washed up right after the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight, because he loses to Sergio Mora in what was not even a championship fight, and he never ever after that becomes world champion. He never becomes top of the welterweight or super welterweight division ever again. Okay, so we know he's done for in the Sergio Mora fight, and he never shows any redemptive qualities. Okay, so what do we know? Shane Mosley performed outside of his prime for a significant portion of time. There was some up and down moments, but he did become the #1 welterweight in the world after his prime was done, and that's all the way back in 2001. Mosley had became a super welterweight champion after his prime. He became welterweight champion and #1 welterweight in the world after his prime. So he did a number of things. But when he got washed up, and Mosley is a washed up fighter now, when he got washed up, he has no longer won a world title. In fact, the caliber of opposition he's faced has beaten him. There's no way Anthony Mundine would have beaten Shane Mosley when he was at the top of his game. Alright? Sergio Mora got a draw with him. You can argue Sergio Mora beat him. And Mosley would usually not be beaten by a guy like that. So it tells you that Mosley was pretty much washed up after the Mayweather fight. Now, Floyd Mayweather. This is the last guy I'm going to talk about. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was born in 1977. He began boxing in the year 1996 at the age of 19, which means 11 years from 1996, which would be 2007, he would be at the end of his statistical prime, at least what we're using, which means he would be at the end of his prime when he faced Oscar De La Hoya and Ricky Hatton. Now, if you know anything about Floyd Mayweather Jr., more of the notable names that Floyd Mayweather Jr. had in his career came after he had finished his prime. In 2009, he faced Juan Manuel Marquez, then Shane Mosley in 2010, Victor Ortiz in 2011, Miguel Cotto, Robert Guerrero, Saul Canelo Alvarez, Marcos Maidana, Manny Pacquiao, and Andre Berto, all notable names in boxing. He all faced them after his prime. Now, because Floyd Mayweather told us when his physical prime was over, and we can all see that, he really went to turn. He actually went downwards from his prime in 2005. So Mayweather's prime actually finished 2 years earlier than the usual average. So he was 28 years of age when he faced Arturo Gatti, and that was pretty much his pinnacle act, and he went downhill from there physically as well as performance-wise, even though he was at the top of his division. So when he faced Sean Bay Mitchell, he was not in his prime, nor Zab Judah, nor Carlos Baldomir, nor Oscar De La Hoya, nor Ricky Hatton. How do we know this? Well, Mayweather displayed power, speed, quickness, and all of these things, elasticity, in his prime. He knocked out Arturo Gatti. He knocked down DeMarcus Corley multiple times. He knocked out Henry Bercelis. He knocked out Philip Endu. He knocked out Victoriano Sosa. He beat up Jose Luis Castillo. Couldn't knock him out because Jose Luis Castillo was just a big, strong dude. Stopped Jesus Chavez. Beat up and dropped Carlos Hernandez. Stopped Diego Corrales. Stopped Emmanuel Augustus. Beat Gregorio Vargas to a pulp. Okay? In other words, what I'm saying is Floyd Mayweather had everything. He had knockout power, all the tools that were necessary. Floyd Mayweather had it up to Arturo Gatti. And of course, you could say Sean Bay Mitchell. But after that, you would notice Floyd couldn't knock out anyone. Not only could he not knock out anyone, but the other point is he had to change up his game, not only because the fighters were bigger, but also he had to change up his game, not being as explosive as spectacular, but more calculated, because he had to find ways and means to make the most of every single punch he threw. It wasn't that Floyd didn't have power, it's that he had to preserve his hands so that he could actually make use of that power effectively. You didn't really see Floyd going for the kill anymore. You saw it against Sean Bay Mitchell, Arturo Gatti, Henry Brussels, DeMarcus Corley, and so on. In other words, I'm telling you, Floyd was out of his prime in 2005, at the end of 2005. That was it. Okay? So Floyd Mayweather was able to be at the top of the game in boxing, the pound for pound #1 boxer, the boxer ranking in the most amount of cash, the most desired boxer to fight in the welterweight division outside of his prime. And all of this just to let you guys know this, that the whole argument that a fighter is in their prime and this guy didn't fight this fighter in his prime and this guy didn't fight his fighter in his prime really are they're important arguments, but they really aren't the only thing. They're incomplete arguments. You have to talk about, did this fighter fight this fighter while he was at the top of his division? Or at the top of the organization like the WBC or WBA. If someone's a world champion, it means they're at the top of the organization they're in. So Floyd Mayweather Jr. himself was outside of his prime when he faced a lot of fighters who were outside of their primes. But he also faced a lot of fighters who were also in their primes. And that says a lot about Floyd Mayweather. He faced Marcos Maidana, who was still in his prime. Saul Canelo Alvarez, who was in his prime. Robert Guerrero, who was in his prime. Victor Ortiz, who was in his prime. Okay? Ricky Hatton, who was in his prime. All of this he faced while he himself was not in his prime. Okay? He faced Zab Judah while Zab Judah was in his prime. Now, that's very important for you guys to understand. Mayweather fought a lot of boxers who were in their primes when he himself was not in his prime. So, I say all of this to let you guys know something very important, and I hope this helps everybody. That it's more important that the fighter is healthy and that the fighter is performing at the optimum level he can perform. That he's not washed up and that he's at the top of his respective division. That is more important than whether a boxer is in his prime. Sometimes a boxer not being in his prime is actually a blessing to that boxer. I've known of a number of boxers who were in their prime, sensational, they got knocked out or they got defeated, and they became better boxers for it, smarter boxers. And while they didn't have the athleticism or the explosiveness or the excitement that they brought before, the sensationalism, they got wins over fighters they normally wouldn't get wins over. So, to say that a fighter is in their prime is an important argument. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to trivialize it. But you will notice that usually the all-time greats were able to go beyond their primes and still dominate their divisions and do some remarkable things going up in weight that they wouldn't have been able to do in their primes because they didn't have the savvy and the thought process to be able to accomplish those things. And yes, a fighter in his prime has experience, but fighters learn as they go along in their careers. And sometimes a veteran's experience is much different to a guy who is not starting out in his career, but in the middle of his career. So, on that note, I hope you guys learned something. You guys have a great one.